isn't just for people. To be clear, the people in Utah, couples in Utah are more than welcome to come. We're happy to have you come. But you can also fly into Salt Lake City. If you haven't been to Utah before, you can fly in, attend this 2-day couples workshop, and then spend some time exploring. There's some great things to do. Now, the weather early November is somewhat unpredictable. We could have leaves that are still changing. We could have early snow that time of year. I have no idea what the weather is going to be like, but there is some great things to go and do and see here in Utah. So that's announcement number 1. Look for that information on our events page on our website. Give me a week to have that up there on the events page, and then you can go, you can see it. That's coming up in less than a month. Announcement number 2 is I'm going to be hitting episode 300 probably around the end of this year. And I decided that's a milestone to hit, episode 300. So I want to know from listeners what ideas you have for me to do on episode 300, any suggestions that you have. What would you like me to cover on episode 300? What do you think I should do to mark that occasion? I want to know your suggestions and I want to get your feedback. So you can go to one of our social media sites, leave me a comment, leave me the suggestions. You can email me at Jackie, Jackie, JackiePack.com. That's PACK. Or you can go to our YouTube channel. You can leave me a comment there. That's Healing Paths Inc., I believe it is, on YouTube. And if you're a Patreon member, it's really easy to contact me in the Patreon app. So those are your options for reaching out to me and letting me know your suggestions or feedback for episode 300. And then one more announcement. I mentioned somewhat casually a couple of episodes ago. I don't actually know what episode that I mentioned it on, but I have had a couple of people reach out and ask me because I had mentioned doing a podcast episode talking about what is being termed this crisis among young men ages 18 to 29, 18 to 30. And I'd mentioned that I wanted to do a podcast episode about that. And then I had a couple of people reach out to me, ask me, hey, do you have a timeline as to when you think you'll be recording those episodes? Had some people express interest. But I needed to take some time to read what the experts were talking about when it comes to this issue. I wanted to, know what the experts are seeing, what they're looking at. And then I was kind of getting it in my head, thoughts about how I wanted to talk about it. And then I started recognizing that maybe it wouldn't go as well from some middle-aged white female talking about this. So I was thinking, what men do I know who I think could cover this topic in a way that's interesting to listeners? I immediately thought of 2 men that I know, reached out to both of them through text. Both of them responded really quickly and said, happy to help out here, happy to give my thoughts on this. They're not that age range, 18 to 29. They're both older than that. But I thought they have been young men. I know the one has a son who's in that age range. And so I'm going to be recording the first podcast episode about that with one of the men this coming weekend. So I'm excited for that. That will be our next podcast episode 9. And then I'm still working on dates to schedule with the other guy that I reached out to. And I just think those will be good episodes to listen to. They're both going to talk about different things, not because I'm telling them to, just because knowing their personality, I know they're both going to have a different angle that they're coming at as they talk about that. So I'm excited for that. Now let's get into today's podcast episode. I've talked before in different episodes about some of my pet peeves, things that just get under my skin. I think probably the most frequent one that I mention is drivers who go slow, who go below the speed limit on the freeway, or even who just go the speed limit, but they happen to be in the fast lane on the freeway. Those 2 things just drive me crazy. but I also am aware a couple years ago, I want to say maybe it was the summer of 2021, here in Utah, we had several incidences of road rage where people were shot and killed or badly injured. And I was aware of that happening, but having several of those in one summer just put it more on my radar. So yeah, I'm just getting angry in my car. I don't flip people off. I don't honk my horn or flashlights or anything like that. I don't aggressively drive. I've never aggressively driven my car, but it just drives me crazy. Also, I'm on the road pretty much every day. I'm commuting to the office and home. And so that's probably why it's the most frequent one I've talked about, is because I'm experiencing it pretty much on a daily basis. But I also have some professional pet peeves. Things like people diagnosing narcissism, when the truth is it's not that simple to diagnose somebody with narcissistic personality disorder. And it takes some time assessing. You also have to be qualified to assess that diagnosis. You have to spend time interacting with the person, and you have to understand behind the scenes diagnostic criteria in order to really apply a genuine diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. But wow, the amount of people who claim the person they're breaking up with or that they're divorcing, they're ending some type of relationship with, is a narcissist is astounding. And the reality is, no, not everyone who gets divorced or breaks up with somebody is breaking up with or divorcing a narcissist. Another professional pet peeve I have is some people completely miss the point when it comes to boundaries. So when I talk about boundaries, I will often say boundaries keep you safe from others. But the second part of that is also key, and that is boundaries also keep others safe from you. And I've heard people who will twist the concept of boundaries, and they're just not aware that they might be crossing other people's boundaries. And then if somebody pushes back, all of a sudden it's like, hey, you're crossing my boundaries. You're violating my boundaries. And yeah, they might be, but you might need to check yourself first if you're unaware that boundaries go two ways. Yes, they are to protect ourselves. They are also to protect others from us. And so we have to be respecting other people's boundaries and not just expecting people to respect our boundaries. I've also heard people twist the concept of shame into a thing that if they feel shame at all, whoever they deem is making them feel that is that. Like, you're shaming me, and that's that, regardless of what I've done. And I've had clients before who come in and they're telling me about a situation, and they're telling me about a conflict they had with their partner or a friend or something like that. And they will say to me, my partner shamed me. And because I've gotten some of the information and they've told me what they've done, I might be saying to them, well, I think in this instance, it is correct for you to feel some shame because of how you behaved in this particular situation. The way that they're telling me how they responded, or maybe things that were said that were demeaning or putting this other person down, or they were just full of contempt. That is a shameful way of behaving, especially when this is somebody close in our life. But I don't even think it's appropriate to behave that way with people we don't really know or occasionally interact with. And if we are doing something that is shameful, we should feel shame. It's not appropriate for us to be shameless. And then that shame that we feel moves us into making amends, making repairs, correcting, and apologizing at the very least. So that's another professional pet peeve I have, where shame just gets convoluted. And then the last thing that I want to talk about, and we're actually going to get into this for this particular podcast episode, and that is misunderstanding gaslighting to the point that if anyone feels somebody is challenging their beliefs, they will claim that this person is gaslighting them, when really it just might be different beliefs, or, like I said, somebody challenging their beliefs. The other thing that is a misuse of the term gaslighting is just using gaslighting interchangeably with manipulation. And gaslighting is more specific than that. Yes, it is a form of manipulation, But all manipulation can't be called gaslighting. And I think gaslighting is a specific form of manipulation. So in this particular episode, we're going to get into misunderstanding gaslighting. In this episode, I want to talk about gaslighting. I want to get into what it is, also what it is not, what people get wrong about the term, and why it can be so hard to recognize gaslighting when you're in it or on the receiving end of it. I want to talk about the various areas that gaslighting can show up. Often we think of gaslighting happening in relationships, and it can, but it can also show up in other areas outside of relationships. Although most people are going to recognize it or start to see it in their relationships. And then lastly, I want to talk about how we start the healing process from gaslighting. So let's get into the concept of gaslighting and what it is. I always like to start with a definition. And one of the things, I don't think I've ever mentioned this before on the podcast. My kids think I was weird as a kid growing up. But as a kid growing up, going through high school, I often would read the dictionary. I think I was just fascinated with different words that mean the same. So synonyms or antonyms or just expanding my vocabulary. It was also the 80s. My kids don't understand the 70s and 80s and that it's not just me. And so let's start with the definition. Gaslighting is a type of psychological abuse that involves manipulating someone into questioning their own reality. Sometimes the term that I will use it interchangeably with is crazy making. I think gaslighting makes people feel like they are crazy. It makes them mistrust their instincts. It makes them mistrust their own intuition. It might require them to mistrust what their eyes are seeing or what their ears are hearing. The goal with gaslighting is to gain power and control over the victim by making them doubt themselves and compromising their ability to trust themselves. The word gaslighting has had a dramatic increase in use. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary named it its most used word of the year in 2022. Interest in the term rose by 1,740% over the previous year. So between 2021 and 2022, I just think that's crazy to have that type of increase in one particular word. 1,740% increase from just the previous year. So why are people talking about gaslighting so much? Are they using it correctly? Are they seeing it where they need to? I don't know that that's happening, but I think it's interesting to start to look into and ask some questions. As I was saying, gaslighting can happen in any relationship. It doesn't just show up in romantic relationships. It can happen between friends. It can happen between family members. And often it's pretty subtle at first. Let's talk about some examples of gaslighting in relationships. Sometimes what the gaslighter will do is change the details. If you're having a conversation or you're talking about a situation, it might be in conflict, but also it can happen outside of conflict. Let's say you're just talking about a previous memory that both of you had that wasn't necessarily bad. Maybe it was good. Maybe it was just neutral. But the gaslighter will change small details in the story or the memory from how you remember it. This might include changing what you saw and what you heard. They're changing those details in a way that makes you start to question your own memory. And they're stating those differences in the memory very matter-of-factly. Another example might be calling other people crazy, the other people in your life. The gaslighter often tells the victim that other people in their life, these others, are crazy, they're lying, and that the gaslighter is the only source of truth. It's using gaslighting as a way of isolating the person or the victim from other people in their life who, if they knew what was going on, or they might be hearing what was happening in the relationship, they might notice that the person is very dysregulated, and this other person in their life, family member, friend, something like that, might be able to suss out the gaslighting rather quickly. but they're not being leaned on as sources of truth. Another example of gaslighting is being overly critical. This might happen with a parent or an authority figure who's overly critical of the victim's decisions, causing them to question their own choices and whether or not they know best for themselves, whether or not they can even make good decisions. Gaslighting causes victims to feel confused, anxious, isolated, depressed, and like they're losing their grip on reality. Some of these words that I just talked about can show up in other mental health diagnoses or other abuse patterns. But I think the key factor here is they feel like they're losing their grip on reality. That doesn't necessarily happen in other situations where they feel like they don't even remember things factually. They won't trust their memory. That's not typically happening in other situations with other mental health diagnoses. The long-term effects from gaslighting or being in a relationship with someone who is gaslighting you include a loss of confidence and self-esteem, which totally makes sense. Uncertainty about their emotional or mental stability, which also makes sense. They just stop communicating their own wants and needs, and they have difficulty trusting themselves or other people, minus this person who is gaslighting them. They will have a high degree of trust in them. The term gaslighting comes from the 1938 stage play, Gaslight. And then there was a movie made about it as well, in which a husband attempts to drive his wife crazy by dimming the lights. And the lights at this time were powered by gas. So he would dim the lights in their home, and then his wife would notice that the lights seemed dimmer, but he would deny that. He would say, "No, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't notice that." And then he would turn the lights back up, and she would notice that. And again, he would deny that. And he would state, "The lights are not changing," even though he knows they are because he's the one doing that. But he's making her start to feel crazy. That what she's seeing, what she's noticing isn't happening, that nothing had actually changed. And so often when I'm saying it can start in subtle ways, it's things like that. And it's typically not going to happen in conflict initially, because if it's happening in conflict, we're more likely to see it if that's the first place we're starting to see it show up. Like I said, gaslighting is a highly effective form of emotional abuse and psychological abuse, causing the victim to question their own feelings, their own instincts, their sanity, their reality. And as a result, the abusive partner has a lot of power over them. I want to point out here that we do know that abuse is about power and control in all of the various ways that it can show up. Once an abusive partner has broken down the victim's ability to trust their own perceptions, the victim is much more likely to stay in the abusive relationship because they trust this partner who's gaslighting them. That's the person that they rely on. That's the person who comforts them when they feel like they're crazy, which is its own type of emotional abuse, that the gaslighter is the person comforting this person when they're the ones making them crazy. As I've said, generally, gaslighting happens gradually in a relationship. In fact, the abusive partner might even seem harmless at first. It might seem like just a difference in perspective or a difference in the memory. Over time, however, these abusive patterns continue. They might increase from being more passive and subtle. And as a result, the victim becomes confused. They become anxious, they're isolated, and usually they're depressed. They can lose all sense of what is actually happening. And then they start relying on this abusive partner more and more to define their reality, which can create a very difficult situation to escape. One of the things that often gets missed when people are talking about gaslighting, but they're doing it incorrectly, is gaslighting is intentional. If somebody isn't aware of the truth, or there is just a difference in perspective, or there is a difference in memory, it's not going to be gaslighting. Gaslighting, the person doing the gaslighting knows they're doing it. They know that the partner is onto something, that they might be getting close to the truth. We'll talk about this more as I talk about some of the signs and examples of gaslighting. In order to overcome this type of abuse, it's important to start recognizing the signs and then eventually start learning to reconnect to yourself and starting to trust yourself again. Sometimes that's also going to happen first as we start to reconnect to these other people in our life who we used to trust, and they are trusting us. According to author and psychoanalyst Robin Stern, the signs of being a victim of gaslighting include constantly second-guessing yourself. You might be asking, am I too sensitive? You could be asking yourself that multiple times a day. You often will feel confused and crazy. You're always apologizing, and you can't understand why, with so many apparently good things in your life, you aren't happier. You might be frequently making excuses for your partner's behavior to your friends or family. And then you might just start withholding information altogether from friends and family, so you don't have to explain or make excuses for this person anymore. You might know or feel that something is wrong, but you can't quite find the words to express what it is or quite put your finger on it. So the victim of gaslighting might start lying in order to try to avoid the put downs and the reality twists. A sign that you're being gaslit might be that you are having trouble making simple decisions. And you might have a sense that you used to be a very different person. Maybe you were more confident, you were more fun-loving, and you were more relaxed and chill. And now you're feeling hopeless and joyless. You might feel as though you can't do anything right, and you start to wonder if you're good enough. There's also a variety of gaslighting techniques that an abusive partner might use. The first one is withholding, where the abusive partner pretends not to understand or just refuses to listen to them because they're so off base. They're so ridiculous. The gaslighter might say things like, I don't want to hear this again, or you're just trying to confuse me, when in reality, the opposite is true. Another way a person might gaslight is countering. This is where the abusive partner questions the victim's memory of events, despite the victim seeming to remember them very accurately and very clearly. The gaslighter would keep countering with different perspectives, pointing out how wrong the person is, how wrong the memory is. Another example is blocking or diverting, in which the abusive partner changes the subject or questions the victim's thoughts. This can sound like, that's another crazy idea you get from your friend or family member, fill in the blank. Or you're just imagining things. Gaslighters can also trivialize the situation and trivialize this other person, making them feel like their needs or their feelings are just not important. They might say things like, really, you're going to get angry over something that small? Or you're just being too sensitive? They might employ forgetting and denial, in which the abusive partner pretends to have forgotten what actually occurred, or denies things like a promise that was made to the person. So this might sound like, I don't know what you're talking about, or now you're just making stuff up. And then one of the last examples of how gaslighters might employ tactics is flipping the script, where the partner is bringing up a legitimate concern and the gaslighter flips the script. They might change it to another subject in which the victim is the problem. And so the victim ends up apologizing and taking responsibility, when in reality, what they brought up, the gaslighter should be the one apologizing and taking accountability. I think the most common gaslighting phrase that gets used with gaslighting is, it was just a joke. And people say that when the person is actually saying something that's mean or cruel and hurtful. When the person being gaslit has natural feelings because of the words that they're saying, the gaslighter would just be like, oh my gosh, it's just a joke. You're so sensitive. I can't even joke around with you. So how would you tell if you're being gaslit? Signs that you're being gaslit include apologizing all the time, feeling minimized, constantly doubting your own feelings and self-worth, because those are getting questioned. I've had situations with clients where gaslighting is happening, and they might start to tell a story which is coherent to me. It sounds like they know and remember the narrative. And then in the middle of telling it, they just stop talking. They may be saying things like, I don't even think you can understand me, or I don't think I'm getting this right. I'm probably not even making sense to you. Maybe I was just overreacting. And to the person listening, or when it's been me listening, I can tell something just happened inside this other person. And usually I might say, what's going on with you? It was making sense. I was following you. It seemed like you knew what you were talking about. But they're beginning to doubt their own feelings. They're doubting their self-worth. If you think you're part of a gaslighting relationship, it's going to be helpful and necessary for you to seek help from friends, family members, and a mental health professional, which is going to be difficult because your ability to trust others and yourself has been so compromised. Let's talk about one of the pet peeves I mentioned earlier. If a person is gaslighting, does that mean the person is a narcissist? Again, like I said, diagnosing somebody with narcissistic personality disorder is complex and it takes time. Gaslighting might be one of the ways that narcissistic individuals would manipulate others, but it wouldn't be the entirety of narcissism itself. I think sometimes when we're looking for things like that, we're trying to make something that is actually pretty complex simple. We're trying to make things black and white. So it's like checkbox, gaslights, check. That's not really how we diagnose somebody. I think based on a person gaslighting, we can't say that that means they're narcissistic because there's more criteria and there's more things that we have to assess. But this is a form, gaslighting. However, gaslighting is a form of emotional and psychological abuse. And not everybody who is abusive is necessarily a narcissist. One of the other things that I think is interesting about gaslighting is that there are gender differences. Although both men and women can be the victims of gaslighting, men are more likely to gaslight women than women are to gaslight men. Now, a lot of this boils down to gender inequalities that can lead to gaslighting because our culture, our patriarchal structure, gives men more power and it takes away women's social power. Women are also often socialized to doubt themselves and apologize for disagreeing with others, or they're expected to be pleasant and smooth things over, to make things okay for everybody, to be taking care of other people at the expense of themselves. These socialized gender differences can then be used in ways that are turned on women and make them more likely targets of being gaslit. There's also psychological issues along with social issues where women have a hard time advocating for themselves because of how they're socialized to expect certain reactions from people. For example, if women speak up, if women state something clearly or state their opinion or state their recollection or their observations, they may not be expecting to be believed or to be taken seriously. While men tend to be more vocal and more persistent with their concerns, and they expect to be heard and taken seriously. I mentioned patriarchy, which plays a part in the gender differences, where women are particularly susceptible to gaslighting, because patriarchy thrives on sustaining power over women and putting them in a one-down power situation. And society sometimes depicts women as being more irrational or less in control of their emotions than men are. Now, I would say that is not the case. And we have a lot of examples that we can point to where men are being irrational and their emotions are taking over and making them quite illogical. And as I said, gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse that happens when one person convinces their victim that they're remembering things wrong. They're misinterpreting events, which over time disconnects them from their own intuition. They don't trust their gut anymore. They feel crazy in their body. They would be very emotionally dysregulated. One of the key things that I hear when people are misusing the term gaslighting, let's take this in a situation. Let's say it's two friends, or it could be two people in a romantic relationship. One person is stating their perspective. And I've talked about this in other podcast episodes, especially in my work with couples, that each person in a coupleship, or it might be two friends, everybody's going to have their own perspective of a situation, of events. because their perspective is informed by their gender. It's informed by their previous experiences. It's informed based on the family that they grew up in. A lot of things can lead into those differences of perspective. And often when I'm working with couples on communicating, I tell them, the goal here is not to get to the same page. We're not both going to share our perspectives and then argue over which perspective wins. Although I think a lot of couples do that. But having different perspectives does not mean one person is gaslighting the other person. Although they can, in that process of having differences of perspectives and arguing over those, they can say things that might be verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, because they're arguing for their perspective to be right. But having a difference in perspective is not necessarily gaslighting. If I'm working with a couple and this is happening in my office, I'll usually lean in, I'll ask them to pause, and I am going to try to back them out of that conflict, get them more emotionally regulated in their body. And then again, remind them that the goal here is understanding. We're not trying to prevail with your viewpoint. And I'll often say, as many people as there are, that's how many perspectives we are going to have. There might be some common overlap in perspectives, and there's also going to be some differences. One of the things that I might see happening is a misunderstanding of gaslighting, where it comes to one person that is being deemed to be the gaslighter also doesn't know the truth. One of the ways that I see gaslighting being misinformed is where the person who's being deemed to be the gaslighter also doesn't know the truth. They don't know, they're not trying to gaslight the other person, or there is just a difference. So gaslighting has to be intentional. Take the movie or the play Gaslight. The husband knows full well what he's doing. He knows he's turning down the lights. He also knows he's then turning up the lights. And when his wife notices or observes that there's a difference, he's lying to her, and he knows he's lying to her. I had a situation several years ago with a couple that I was working with, and the wife came in for a session by herself. I saw them both individually, and then we would also do some joint sessions. And so the wife came in that particular day. She was talking about how several weeks ago she had been at the mall during the day. And she was at one of those stores in the mall that the store itself actually has 2 stories. So within that store, it had its own escalator. So she's coming down from the top floor of the store. She's on the escalator, coming down to the bottom level of the store. And she glances over at the jewelry counter as she's coming down the escalator and sees her husband with a younger woman. They're holding hands. They're both looking at the jewelry. They're discussing. She's pointing out what she's like. And the woman at the counter is helping them. And the wife doesn't go over and confront them. She doesn't say anything. I think she was in some level of shock about what she was seeing. And she just goes out to the car and drives home. When the husband gets home that night, she asks, "Hey, what were you doing at the mall today?" She starts with just a little bit of the information she knows, but doesn't go into everything that she saw or witnessed. And he gives her some story that, she knows is not accurate, but he does acknowledge that he was at the mall. And she starts asking him some different questions. And then she just comes out and says, "I saw you at the jewelry counter holding hands with a younger looking woman than me, being helped at the jewelry counter, and it looked like you were buying her a piece of jewelry." At this point, he got pretty defensive. He got angry. But what he was angry about was the fact that his wife had been at the mall. And he starts going into this tirade about how she spends too much money. She's wasting time during the day. She's not doing what she should be or could be doing. She was a stay-at-home mom, but also her kids were older. They're all in school. The family wasn't struggling financially, but he's getting mad at her for being at the mall. And he's telling her, "I've told you before, you're spending too much money." And he's getting mad that she was at the mall. And she ends up apologizing to him and acknowledging that he has expressed concerns over her spending habits. And that's what actually settles the conflict, is her apologizing and taking responsibility for being at the mall. And when she's talking to me, she did feel bad for being at the mall. But by the time she came to me a couple of weeks later, she was telling me, I don't actually think I spend that much money. I wasn't even buying anything that day. I just went to the mall because sometimes I get bored during the day. I was just walking around looking at things. And then I happened to see my husband. And it sounded like she was starting to question if she had actually seen him. And so I'm listening to her and I'm saying, it sounds like you saw something. I don't think that you were imagining seeing your husband standing at the jewelry counter holding hands with a younger looking woman. And I'm just trying to connect her back to the truth her body knows, because she had been emotionally dysregulated in the couple of weeks before I could get her in for an individual session. And as I started to connect her to her body, I was not questioning her memory. I was not questioning what she had seen, but I was trusting her with what she was telling me. And obviously, I don't know what the truth is because I wasn't there. But I was telling her, it sounds like you saw this. And I don't know that your spouse can tell you that you didn't see something. Also, in my mind, I'm registering that he didn't actually deny anything. And he did acknowledge being at the mall. To me, that was an example of flipping the script, where the partner ends up apologizing for something that initially she was trying to bring up that was a problem with this other person. And then she ends up being the one who's the problem. She's the one who takes responsibility, and she was the one who apologized. When gaslighting is happening, the person who is gaslighting knows what the truth is. They might get nervous that this other person is getting close to also knowing what the truth is. They might be getting close to being exposed. So they turn it back on this other person to make them feel like they're crazy. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I watched the movie Gaslight. The movie, I think, came out in the early 40s, but I think the husband had actually met somebody else and was interested in this other woman and wanted to be able to commit his wife to a mental institution so that he could go on and have this relationship with this other woman. And at that time, a husband could commit a wife to a mental institution for being crazy, and he could have her committed just simply based on his word. But in my experience, if somebody is not also aware of what's happening, or they're just having a difference in perspective, they're going to be saying that in the conversation. They might be saying, well, from what I remember, this is what happened. They're also not likely to be attacking the person in a way of demeaning them. They're not demeaning them in order to get them away from the truth. They're going to be arguing more about whose perspective wins and whose perspective is right and whose perspective is wrong. But that isn't necessarily an indication that one person knows what the truth is and is making the other person doubt themselves. Let's switch a bit and talk about whether gaslighting only happens in primary relationships. I've already said it can happen with friends. It can happen from a parent or another authority figure to a child. It can also happen amongst siblings. But we also know that women are more likely to be gaslit when it comes to their medical care. The Katz Institute for Women's Health released an article talking about gaslighting in women's health. And I want to say here that we also know that Black women are much more likely to be gaslit than white women are. But there can be situations when a procedure is done. I had a client who had a female procedure done. They didn't give her any medication. They didn't give her any numbing, like a topical numbing cream. They didn't do anything so that she wouldn't feel pain. They told her it would be quick, that it wouldn't be that painful. And when she came back after having the procedure done and was talking to me about it, she said, I'm never doing that again without medication. She said, that was one of the most painful things that happened to me. And she was surprised that they did not give medication for that procedure. She said it was actually quite painful. We do know in the medical community that there is still this belief, which is not true, that women tend to have a higher pain tolerance and men have a lower pain tolerance. So men are more likely to get medicated for procedures where the pain threshold is actually less than what the female is experiencing, and she does not get medication for that. In this article by the Katz Institute, they were talking to 4 leading specialists at the Katz Institute for Women's Health. One was a cardiologist, one was a gynecologist, one was a pain specialist, and one was a psychologist. And these medical professionals were offering insights as to why gaslighting still occurs. And they were also offering insights into what women can do to protect themselves from its harmful effects. The question was asked to all of them, why in this day and age is gaslighting still happening? And they pointed out that unfortunately, there are still considerable gender biases in healthcare. Like I said, there's also a significant difference between white women and Black women. There's this myth that Black women have thicker skin. Not when we say, I need to have thick skin to get through something, not like that, like, oh, I should let it bounce off, kind of have thicker skin. But literally, the Black women have thicker skin, which is not true. But it also leads to them having to go through procedures without medication or to be mistreated for things. The cardiologist was talking about published data from a trial highlighting sex and gender differences in cardiovascular disease testing. And he was saying, we've raised this awareness that gaps remain in diagnosing the full spectrum of coronary heart disease in women. But women have a harder time if they go to the ER and say that I might be having a heart attack. They're less likely to be taken serious, and it's harder for them to actually get the testing to determine if something is going on with their heart. The gynecologist was talking about how it's no accident that the word hysteria originates from the Greek word for uterus. There's still a pervasive belief in the medical community that anytime a woman complains about her health, it's either related to her hormones or it's simply all in her. Female hysteria was once a common medical diagnosis for women. And it was applied whenever women displayed what they termed inappropriate emotions. These were emotions like anxiety, anger, and sexual desire. For centuries, it was believed that the uterus itself was the cause of a woman's hysterical symptoms. Now, some of these beliefs still persist today. There's no longer a term hysteria for women, but often there is still this assumption that it's related to hormones or it's psychosomatic. How often does a woman get angry only to be asked if she's about to get her period? Or how often does a perimenopausal woman go to her doctor's office to complain about weight gain only to be told they're not exercising enough? Or they're sent home with diet instructions? Or they're telling them it's related to hormones? Yeah, perimenopause and menopause is all about a change in hormones. And for somebody, myself, who is at that age period, I am shocked at the varying answers that you get from the medical community. I've been talking to friends who are all approaching this period in their life of perimenopause. I've been talking to clients who are also at this stage of life. And the differing opinions that the doctors have, or who will just say, we really don't know. It can last a couple of years, it can last 10 years. And my husband's heard me rant before. But if there is something that definitely affects 51% of the population, which is women, and we don't know that much about menopause, or there's nothing that we can actually do for menopause, that's just crazy to me in 2024. I don't think it's just our hormones making us anxious or upset. I think it's often these condescending attitudes that are making us upset and angry. The pain specialist doctor was talking about how we know that women are more likely than men to experience conditions like migraines. And in the past, doctors often assumed that it was psychosomatic. It can take women who have endometriosis years to get that diagnosis. And it is years of pretty extreme pain for them to actually have a diagnosis of endometriosis. Some of the reasons why women can still be gaslit when it comes to their medical health is because our bodies just don't fit neatly into a cookie cutter. There's been a lot of research that has been done for medical treatment, but it's been done only on men. And then it was just assumed that that would be transferable to women. And I get that women's bodies are more complex. And often when they're doing research, they're hesitant to do a research study including women, where women may become pregnant during the research. and they don't know if this medication is going to harm the developing fetus. Gaslighting can also happen in the workplace. Gaslighting at work is a form of psychological manipulation in which the person gaslighting is often in a place of authority, although not always, and they convince their victim to question their perception of reality. An employee experiencing gaslighting at work might struggle to recognize the signs of gaslighting because it's subtle and it can be sneaky. And sometimes the person doing it is charming and has risen the ranks. As an example, maybe the manager forgets to assign a task to an employee. But when that task comes due, they deny their mistake and insist the employee missed the deadline and just didn't do it. The gaslighter might play dumb and pretend they did nothing wrong. And they might have a reputation of being a great employee, so they're more likely to be believed. But that makes the employee very confused and they start to doubt themselves. So gaslighting at work can occur between a person of power, like a manager, and their reports. Or it can be a boss who leverages their power to assert themselves as being correct, making it difficult for any employees to challenge them. But even without an inherent power balance, workplace gaslighting can occur between employees and it can cause problems. Gaslighting at work often occurs in three scenarios: managers gaslighting employees, coworkers gaslighting each other, and then group gaslighting, or managers and coworkers ganging up on one particular target. Gaslighting also happens in the media. According to Bernard J. Luskin, MFT, and a doctorate in education, in his book, The Media Psychology Effect, he writes, quote, "Gaslighting has become culturally pervasive through social media. Conspiracy theories, trolls, fake news, and deepfakes are examples of tactics continuously reinforced through use on social media platforms. Conspiracy theories, trolls, fake news, and deepfakes are examples of tactics continuously reinforced through use on social media platforms like Twitter, Truth Central, CNN, Fox News, CNBC, Truth Social, and YouTube. The number of streaming services continues to grow, and many include gaslighting programming that's intended to influence social and political issues. It has become important to facilitate a wide public understanding of gaslighting." End quote. Media manipulators use all forms of technology to massage messages designed to influence large numbers of viewers in ways that give the messenger predetermined and self-serving meaning. Media psychology helps to explain gaslighting and assists our understanding of its hows and whys, saying that understanding the phenomenon is especially timely. During the COVID years, media gaslighting dramatically increased. The COVID years also dramatically increased the number of streaming channels and companion technologies, increasing the wide-scale use of gaslighting for influencing, persuading, group manipulating, and opinion laundering in personal, social, and political contexts. One of the examples I first think of is, I'll use the term lightly, journalists on Fox News who were attacking the COVID vaccination, who were putting out all sorts of false and misleading information to their viewers about the vaccination, when in reality, we found out years later, all of them were vaccinated. But that was not information that they gave to their public or their viewers. Pictures, graphics, and sound are the stuff media communication is made of. The physiology of the senses in the brain is manipulated so that targeted perceptions are created in the mind. Synesthesia is a word that is used for coupling of the senses. Semiotics is communication through symbols and icons. And then semantics is the manipulation and use of words. All of these combine to foster perceptions translated and expressed through language into actions, behaviors, and embedded memories. Capturing attention, using repetition, psychovisualization, and compounded memory, the gaslighting effect is achieved. Calculated gaslighting can be an insidious exercise of power and control that creates and magnifies uncertainty. And once you have people feeling uncertain, it does not take much to move them into fear. And it causes them to mistrust everything they hear, feel, and remember. Gaslighting statements in media are designed to gain power over others. In situations of media gaslighting, it's important to understand that awareness is the antidote to gaslighting. Understanding the abuses to which media is subject can help neutralize and expose those who intentionally gaslight others to further personal motives. The potential for victimization also underscores the need to educate the general population on how to develop and apply critical thinking skills when they're consuming media. And then the last area, and I'm sure this isn't going to be surprising to you, where gaslighting is employed is in politics. Gaslighting happens in the heated world of politics and elections. It's important to say that not every politician is a gaslighter, but those who propagate disinformation and lies in order to manipulate people into supporting them have earned that title of gaslighter. And I'm going to talk about some research about that in just a minute. But gaslighting is a real concern in public debates. We see it when politicians deny saying things that they've been caught on tape saying, when they deny actions that people witnessed, or it was recorded and has been replayed, or words that were said by them to make up their own reality and then insist it's based on facts, even though the experts know that it's not. I think one of the biggest areas where we've seen some problems coming is the Dunning-Kruger effect, where so many people claim to be experts when in reality they're not. But they are putting information out there as though they are. And some of the general public is not picking up the fact that they're actually not. You may have heard me talk about before on the podcast that I have a Tesla. And I love my Tesla car for a lot of reasons. I bought it in 2020 when I turned 50. And there's a lot that I love about my Tesla. But we've seen Elon Musk, who, I mean, technically is not the inventor of Tesla. And he wasn't even one of the founders of the Tesla company. He did buy it. And then I don't understand exactly what happened. He must have paid them something or made some agreement to be listed as one of the original founders of the company. But the reality is he is not. Now, I'm not saying Elon Musk is not brilliant in many aspects, but that doesn't mean he's brilliant across the board. I don't think anybody is genius in all areas of life. And we've seen him start to go into lanes in which he's not an expert on. But because he's seen as an expert in other areas, we give him that credence, or we give him the respectability that he must be a genius in this situation as well. One of the biggest divides in American politics isn't red versus blue. It's often the divide between what the elected officials actually think and believe and what their own voters think and believe. We rarely focus on this divide because we rarely have actual data to back up this idea. You might occasionally have a reporter say something along the lines of what this person believes and how they vote are two different things. Thanks to researchers at UMass Amherst, we now have answers to this question. They did a poll led by one of the school's co-directors, Alex Theodoridis. Not sure if that's how you pronounce the last name. They decided to survey former living members of Congress, so people no longer in Congress, but still alive. According to their methodology statement, 293 former members responded to the online survey. 237 of them actually completed the survey, out of more than 500 members of Congress that were asked to participate through the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. The party split among their respondents, 55% Democrats, 45% Republicans, and 44 states and 1 territory were represented. Now, it's worth noting that 83% of the sample was male and over 90% were white. That's also not too surprising because Congress's ranks have been overwhelmingly white and male until relatively recently. What makes this survey worth chewing over is that UMass compared the answers the former members of Congress gave with how the general public over the last year had answered some of these survey questions. UMass regularly conducts national polls, and it used a merged sample of its 2023 data for comparative purposes. And here's what it found. The former elected members of Congress, especially the former Republican members, appear to view the democracy a lot differently right now than rank-and-file GOP voters. Let's start with the big question of whether the 2020 election was legitimate, which I'm just going to say here, it was. So let's see how former members responded to that. Among Republicans nationally, just 26% believe that Joe Biden's victory was legitimate. Among former GOP members of Congress, a whopping 82% believe that Biden won legitimately. On the issue of whether Donald Trump's election fraud claims threaten democracy, just 18% of GOP voters believe that, while 64% of former GOP members of Congress do believe that. And then there's the January 6th riot at the Capitol. Among GOP voters, 74% believe the attack was simply a protest, and only 14% of GOP voters call it an insurrection. However, among the former GOP members of Congress, 53% described it as an insurrection, with 54% calling it a protest. And some of them believe that it was both a protest and an insurrection. The former lawmakers also had an opportunity to answer some open-ended questions in the survey, and the resulting word clouds are quite telling. For instance, when they were asked to describe the current state of Congress, the most commonly used word was, drum roll, dysfunctional, which is not a shock, given how often current members of Congress use that word to describe the place. When it came to describing the overall political environment, the three most commonly used words were polarized, toxic, and media. And if it's not obvious, the appearance of the word media was a negative. More than 80% of the former members believe the legislative branch has ceded too much power to the executive, while over 60% believe the legislative branch has also lost too much power to the judiciary. And that was a belief that crossed party lines. But the big news in this project was the divide between elected Republicans and their voters. I referred earlier to Robin Stern. Robin is the co-founder and the senior advisor to the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. She's a psychoanalyst in private practice and the author of The Gaslight Effect, Recovery Guide, and the host of the Gaslight Effect podcast. Mark Brackett, PhD, is the founding director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence and a professor in the Child Studies Center at Yale. He's the lead developer of Ruler, an evidence-based approach to social and emotional learning, and the author of Permission to Feel. Both Robin and Mark talked about the problem that political gaslighting plays, and they pointed to 5 ways that political gaslighting is seen. Number 1, political gaslighting sells confusion, division, and doubt. It deflects, uses jabs of shame, criticism, and conversation pivots. People who are political gaslighters also need to prove that they are right despite evidence to the contrary. They're usually unwilling to take accountability for their actions or their words. The way to prevent being politically gaslit, especially this close to an election, is to educate yourself, even at the risk of having to alter your opinions based on what you learn. There's a quote that I like that says, "Changing your mind is the best evidence that you have one." I think that applies here. Here are some of the questions to ask yourself when similar viral pieces pop into your inbox or your newsfeed. And we're going to see this increase over the next 20-something days. Does the author cite reliable sources? Now, that's a different question from, are there sources? Because not all sources are reliable. And if you don't know what reliable sources are, that's a good place to start. You're going to have to click on the links that are provided and see who the authors are. Do the authors confuse opinions with facts? Do the authors deploy logical fallacies? Does the author tell you not to educate yourself further or demean the pursuit of more information? Or link to other articles that say basically the same things they are saying? Those are some of the ways and areas where we're going to see gaslighting. But now I want to talk about what to do if you're being gaslit in your relationships. First, I think it's really important to learn what gaslighting is. Awareness is the first step towards healing. You can't fix something that you don't know is a problem. It is crucial to gain a solid understanding of what gaslighting entails. By learning about manipulation tactics and identifying their signs, you can more easily spot when someone is trying to distort your sense of reality. This awareness empowers you to stand firm, to protect your perception, and reducing the feeling of vulnerability. The second thing you can do is talk to someone you trust. And again, this can be difficult due to isolation and the effects of gaslighting. People with low self-esteem or a trauma history can have trouble opening up and trusting another person. However, speaking with a trusted friend, family member, or a professional can be critical in your healing from gaslighting. If you don't trust your own intuition when someone gaslights you, it can be helpful to check things out with this trusted friend or colleague. They can offer you their perspective that may be more objective and help you recognize ways that someone might be gaslighting you. The third thing you can do is self-care and boundary setting. Focusing on self-care, regaining independence, leads to rebuilding self-worth and learning to trust your intuition. When responding to the person who is gaslighting you, stick to facts in a matter-of-fact way. Gaslighters thrive on an emotional response. So stick to the facts and avoid getting defensive or emotional. If the other person tries to twist your words, restate your perspective. You might say things like, yeah, that's part of what happened, but I'm focusing on this part, and fill in the blank with how that applies. Another important way to start healing is to keep records. Gaslighters like to warp your sense of reality. So keeping receipts can help you validate your reality. Document the conversation, the events, and your feelings. This can help provide concrete evidence of manipulation. This record can help clarify your experience, can offer reassurance, and be a valuable tool if you need further support or validation. And the last thing to keep in mind is that not all relationships are salvageable. Sometimes leaving is the healthiest option. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.